France actually had it all. And I think what's interesting about this country that it both had all types of violence, at least classified in our project, and it has one of the most comprehensive de-radicalization plans, at least I'm familiar with. Its efficiency is questionable, but so let us present you first what's going on here. As you can see, and we've visualized some of the data we collected, and it was already very telling. So as you can see in the first slide, right after the title one, you can see all four types of violence: jihadist, separatist, left and right wing, with the orange is the separatist violence. So we had it all. These are 2006. This is just, the last couple of years. What's very interesting about France is the timing of the rise and decline in different types of violence. So as you can see, last decade or 15 years, a sharp decline in separatist violence, which up until 2012 or the 2015 terror acts, as you all heard about the Charlie Hebdo and Bataclan, separatist violence in Corsica, Brittany, Basque Country was very tangible, very scary. It was, a major cause of concern in France, and it practically disappeared. I'll say a few words about maybe why. So jihadist violence has risen since 2012, especially since 2015. There have been many terror acts, at least classified as such and counted as such. The reorganization of the right wing in the past decade, and here we'll talk about the trends that Mihai also mentioned, and some even sporadic violence on the radical left. In the next slide, you can see, and I think this is what's more important about in our discussion, is not how many terror acts have happened, but what are the perceptions in France of it. So these are the numbers of arrests made by the government in different classified, as arresting suspects in different types of violence. One of the big questions is what is defined as terrorism in France. And so these are only terrorist acts. And as you can see also very vividly, I think, France since 2013 becomes increasingly worried about jihadist violence specifically. Separatist arrests are disappearing slowly. And the right wing is really going unnoticed. That is not to say that right-wing violence does not exist. But so this, as you can see here, these interchanges between separatist and jihadist violence in the perception of the state of the main threat, I think is very telling. What's more important, it is not only the government. So the political discourse, the public opinion views, the media is overwhelmingly focusing on jihadist violence. So this is the main threat. An overwhelming majority of the French in the last decade consider jihadist terrorists perhaps even the sole violent extremist threat, certainly in the country. Although, as you can see in the next slide, general racist violence, thank you, Mihai, racist offenses are rising in general. So the trend is, and it is only one type of violence, and this includes anti-Muslim and anti-Semitic, anti-Black, anti-Roma violence. This is only one measure to see that it is not only jihadist extremism that is on the rise. Any attempts happening in France, in public debates, in the Senate, in official government committees, attempting to say we need to assign or give some attention, assign some efforts to address also right-wing violence, extremism, and even radical left, are going completely unnoticed. I think if you want to take one symbolic example, the main anti-terrorism website for the public in France is called Stop Jihadism. And so when in public committees in the Senate, people say, let's rename at least the website and call it anti-terrorism or anti-extremism, it just goes unnoticed because of the focus here. There are many reasons for why this is happening. This is certainly partially because the mediatized impact of the Charlie Hebdo and Bataclan terror that were called in, the French 9/11 were enormous and left an enormous public trauma, collective trauma on the French. But there are also several other factors to this, which we won't discuss in detail now. Moving to the next part, to the next slide, you see here the four types of violence we discussed. But what is more interesting, and this is the next slide, are the links. And so one of the links that Mihai was suggesting is the interaction between jihadists and the right wing. But first, I want to say something about the separatist one. So these are research questions we are framing as we explore the developments in France. The first one is the disappearance of separatist extremism, effective disappearance, has to do with processes of consolidation in the European Union, how Brexit is going to affect this. This is one question. The second point, far right, and it has been detected and analyzed in research, far right mobilization in the past decade in France is partially a response to the perceived, at least, rise in jihadist violence. But it also has other motives, and one of them, for instance, is the alienation of the extremist, violent right wing from the political sphere. So the Front National party, that is now is called Rassemblement National, is trying to mainstream itself and bring itself, closer to defending our Republican values, distance itself from this Holocaust denial nonsense of the founding father of it, and go for the anti-Muslim, anti-immigration discourse that is much more centrist than it used to be even a decade ago. And so the violent right, realizing that it is not going to achieve immediately its goals through the political discourse, is alienating itself, at least from politics. The links between the decline in separatist extremism and the rise of the far right that we mentioned. Finally, we won't go back to the previous slides, but you can interestingly see that there is, and this is a correlation, but the causal links are to be explored. There is a rise in anarchist violence in France with the rise of other types of violence. So when there is a lot of separatist violence, we see a wave of left-wing violence. And when there is a rise in jihadist extremism, we see a rise, very slow, very low, relatively, non-organized, but still a rise. So this is another correlation of just other types of extremism maybe having an impact on the anarchist feelings in France. And going to the last slide, so what is France is doing with all this? This is really in a nutshell, because France has, in the past, certainly from 2001, but from 2012, it has been investing a lot in very diverse fields to de-radicalize everything. So to de-radicalize jihadist, extremism. So the government is reorganized and has this interministerial committee that is only the head of the organization, that has representatives on the regional level and departmental level. It has obviously invested in anti-counter-terrorism measures. So, but the militarized aspects are more or less obvious. More interestingly, France has been investing a lot in a mild version of what might be called re-education. So to explain to the suspects, which France really increasingly merges the Islam and Muslims with radicalization, and there is no distinction, at least in the government discourse, between Muslim or religious radicalization that has to do with fundamentalist beliefs and violent extremism. So it's almost treated as the same thing. So one of the measures to address it is this re-education in schools and in the public spheres, putting an emphasis on one of the major Republican values, which is the laïcité, which is the notion of French secularism, that is supposed to de-escalate both religion, or prevent people from being radicalized religiously, and also to decrease the level of violence. How effective this is? Not very effective, especially since there are also securitization measures introduced in schools. So there is surveillance of students, there is reporting of students who are suspected of being radicalized. Obviously, you can imagine how vague these definitions are, especially for children in secondary education. Another comprehensive line of reforms has been implemented in prisons. It has started with better intentions, where there was some attention being paid to who are the people who are being radicalized, to socially reintegrate them while they leave detention. But it's all been transformed out of lack of budget, attention, and also because of right-wing pressure into a system that right now just groups everyone suspected of radicalization, Islamist radicalization, in one, which of course is one of the drivers of radicalizations in prisons right now. It's being heavily criticized. On a more, perhaps, and here I'm going to be concluding, on a more optimistic side of things, there are also several programs of social reintegration in society that have been initiated in the past 5-6 years. Some of them are taking people who are either going through, some sort of replacement for imprisonment, and so they are going through reintegration programs. There is some data, but there are very few people that have gone through this program. And it's not very clear whether they are going to the program because, or they are joining the program because they're already leaving this path or this ideology on their own, or because the program is actually doing something. And so the Center for Prevention, as you can see here, the Research and Intervention of Extremist Violence, the Program of Individualized Support are all different manifestations that France, but genuinely is trying to implement to see how these people can be de-radicalized. The last point is this Mulhouse program, I think is the most insightful, because this is a regional program done on the regional level of officials cooperating with community leaders. And the key component of this program is that this does not focus only on jihadist extremism or on extremism in general. It is reintegrating and focusing on rehabilitation of criminals or of people involved in crime and involved in violence, not in those necessarily crimes defined by the state as terrorism or radical extremism. And so there is, at least as we can observe, some genuine attempts to find out, to map a program that would be helpful. Most of the programs currently implemented in France, we can carefully say, are at least not very productive. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Roman. Thank you. Steve, you want to say something?
Yes, I just wanted to just say two or three very quick concluding points. And one is, so if we look at what Roman showed earlier, first on separatism, there's clearly a structural force, as Roman mentioned, with the European Union, but there's also political agency. And so the question that one can ask is there a kind of best practices? It seems to be one of the best models, certainly in the French case, for thinking about successful processes of de-radicalization. And I think there are so few successes in this field that it's worth thinking about. The massive decline it is structural partially, but it's not just structural. The second, on the far right, Volodimir's point about the far right being fed by feeding off of jihadism, but it's not clear it's the opposite. This also leads to the essential question of the kinds of outlets that are available once a certain group is influenced. That is, that clearly what the far right is able to do is to instrumentalize jihadist violence. The question is, are jihadists able to instrumentalize, jihadist radicals able to instrumentalize far right discourse? And I think in France we do have a clear case. It's just that you have a sharp asymmetry in terms of the outlets through which that takes place. And finally, I wanted to just reiterate Roman's key point about the left. This is very much, we're at the very early stages of trying to think through this, but it would seem that far left radicalization, which throughout the reports is obviously kind of the part we speak about the least, but one of the reasons perhaps why we speak about it, but why we speak about it less, but one of the reasons why it seems less apparent is that it seems to be more context defined. And that's sort of the element that Roman was bringing out there. That is the far left radicalization and radical violence seems to be more context dependent than either jihadist or far right at the moment. So thank you very much.